Good morning, everyone. We are continuing with this little booklet, Guidelines for Conduct of Members of the Ananda Sevaka Order, but I am endeavoring to make this more, as we're calling it, the Ananda Way of Life, because this specifically applies to only a handful of people, and you already know that. But what this represents, as I was saying yesterday, is what life would look like with self-realization as the goal, and I realize it's a very helpful template for everyone. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel within ourselves the inspiration to live in accordance with thy will. Help us to understand Swamiji's intention in writing these guidelines as a helpful way of understanding how to approach our own lives with the right attitude. Help us to feel your presence within us and to be guided by our desire to be in tune with your presence. Om. Peace. Amen. So I started talking yesterday, just give me a moment. I started talking yesterday about how this little booklet came to be written, how the contents were arrived upon and so on, and I was right in the middle of that, so I'll go on with that. In the early 80s, around 1983 or 84, the proposal was made by the financial managers of the community that if we were formally recognized as a monastic order, then we would have significant tax advantages. Ironic that the government runs our lives, but actually, if you think back to the life of Jesus, how did Jesus come to be born in a stable in Bethlehem? The government decided to do a census, and Mary was there with her mother Anna, and all the Essenes were gathered together, and they were all looking to the birth of the Messiah. And then the government came in and said it was going to do a census, and every family had to go back to their birth city, which happened to be Joseph's birth city, was Bethlehem. And that's why Jesus came from Bethlehem. So the government sometimes plays a very significant role, and then it turned out it was in keeping with the prophecies and so on like that. So what we sometimes call the government Uncle Sam. I wonder how on earth that came about. I'll have to look that up later. But in any case, Uncle Sam, as they say, took an interest in us. And it was a very serious decision, because one of the things that many of us loved about Ananda was that it was quite formless. And Swamiji had lived through SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship, when Master was there, and then after Master died, and then after Master's immediate successor, Rajasi, died, and then the leadership fell into other hands, and gradually what had been quite formless and free became quite well defined with lots of rules. And Swamiji, all through his life, was extremely conscious about the potential negative effects of writing things down on pieces of paper and calling them your rules. Because it becomes much easier then to run your entity by pointing to the piece of paper and pointing to the rule than it does by working intuitively with the situation as it is in the moment. This is always the challenge in a spiritual work, because you do have to get organized to a certain extent. Otherwise, it's very difficult to function. But organizing cannot in itself become the definition of what you're doing. This is where I started yesterday. All that Ananda is, ever has been, and ever will be, as long as it continues to serve its true function, is an opportunity for people to be able to understand how to get in tune and receive the power of grace of this divine ray. And everything else is a means to support that. And one has to be careful that what is meant to support it doesn't gradually begin to suppress it. Where those lines are drawn is a matter of much debate in any institution. So Swamiji, being aware that this was a serious issue, he introduced it the first year that the Yoga Fellowship met, and the second year we looked into it. After the first year, we agreed to let the financial officers investigate it and bring back to us a real idea of whether it could work. And basically, it came down very simply that, of course, it could work. The United States is a remarkable country in certain ways in terms of the extreme protection that is in place in our legal system to allow individuals to self-determine what for them is spiritual and religious. This was not common. Most institutions, most nation states had a defined definition of what was spiritual. When we got into this complicated legal situation in Italy, which was not as protracted as what happened in America, but it was equally intense. Part of the issue was that whereas the country of Italy had on the books freedom of religion, it also had on the books that the definition of religion would be determined by the Catholic Church. And no surprise, there weren't any other true religions but the Catholic Church. I might be overstating that, but not by much. And part of what happened actually at the end of our 7 years of litigation effort there was that we were deemed an actual religion. And that whole structure, our decision and the actions of the judge was the beginning of dismantling that. Buddhism became recognized as a true religion. It might have been recognized just before we were. But in the U.S., you can self-declare. And so a monastic order has, the definition of a monastic order, according to the government, had certain parameters, but we easily met those parameters that people have, by various distinguishing ways, made it very clear that they've separated themselves out from the way society obviously operates, and they've separated themselves out for clearly definable spiritual intention, and that certain vows and certain commitments were part of that. Just because traditionally monasticism was celibate and often impoverished, usually obedience, celibacy, and poverty were the three traditional vows of monastic order. And for us, because we were householders, celibacy was not important. Because we were householders, poverty was not necessarily appropriate, because when you're raising children and so on, you have to provide for them. You can't impose upon them your values before they are of an age when they can accept them, within limits. You can't impose suffering on them out of your conviction. At least we didn't feel that was appropriate. And Swamiji was never keen on obedience, so he wanted cooperation. So simplicity, moderation, and cooperation became the vows that were going to be part of our order. And when we had the second year of discussion about whether we were going to do this or not, the discussion was all about the wonderful freedom we had to self-define. And there was this characteristic about Ananda, especially in the very early years, that even though it's not possible to replicate it in the same way, the vibration and the principle that was represented by those first 10 years especially, at least for me, have been a guiding principle in everything that I've done since. Swamiji was very understated, is putting it mildly, about his own position as the spiritual leader of the community. He was the only one among us who knew Master directly, although occasionally somebody would come through who'd also had some contact with him. But of those who were permanent residents within Ananda village at that time, Swami was the only one who knew Master. He had every right by every tradition of Sanatana Dharma to assert himself. Even in India, they just considered him the guru. Swami felt it was far more appropriate and true to give that reverence to Master and let Swami serve as his disciple. But Swami was so understated in the assertion of his leadership that really, literally, you had to sort of figure it out for yourself. You would come there, and the culture was such, there was no special ceremony around Swamiji. I mean, by the end of his life, when he would come into a room, everyone would fall into silence and stand to greet him. And when he would exit, the same would happen. But at the beginning, Swami would just come in and out of the room like anybody else. It didn't occur to anyone to treat him differently, and that was just how he wanted it. But if you were astute, you gradually began to realize, as someone put it to me, that all the energy was emanating from him. That the power of Ananda was emanating from him. But you see, what was so wonderful about that is that you had to figure that out for yourself. And even when you figured it out, if you did, intuitively, there was no external form. So it was a very sincere environment. It was more chaotic than it might have been. Yesterday I was referring to the fire of 1976, how it sort of cleared the deck of a lot of people who had not figured out what Ananda was really about. But also, it was very, very free. You could just, you had to know from inside how to behave. You couldn't sort of look around and sort of see how you were supposed to be and then behave that way. Somewhere in this context, I'm not sure if it's actually in this booklet or not, but Swamiji even made the comment that when people are coming who want to be members of the community, he said, don't tell them what's expected of them. He said, because if you tell people what's expected of them, then they will behave accordingly. He said, rather just let them live their lives and see how they spontaneously behave. Because then you'll know who people are. And that was very confusing and very difficult. And that's one of the things that had made Ananda both very strong and also very small, is that only a certain kind of person could really be there. So now if we formally declared ourselves a monastic order and then formally defined what that would mean, it was really a line in the sand in Ananda's development. Now, Swami's attitude was always so pragmatic. Master had told him, you have to be practical in your idealism. So you can have all these ideas about how we're going to maintain things and have it all work, but you also have to look at what's practical. And every entity, whether it's a plant or an institution, just has a natural growth period. And nothing lasts forever, and no period of life lasts forever. I remember a mother saying to me once when I asked her children by then were grown, what was the happiest time of your life? Oh, she said, when my children were small and I had them all to myself. I mean, it was sweet in a certain way. And she wasn't bitter and she wasn't unkind. But she loved when her children were small. But of course, children don't stay small. Institutions don't stay new and unformed. If they succeed, they expand and change. So we had this long discussion about what would be good about having more formality and what would be terrible about it. And it was inevitable, is inevitable, that if you become, as we were becoming, a worldwide organization, that was 1985, we were really growing beyond the boundaries of Ananda village. And Europe had begun in Assisi. I think Ocean Song may still have been there. Yes, Ocean Song was still there. The Ananda House in San Francisco, a center in Sacramento, East-West Bookshop was building in Palo Alto, and therefore we were building a center here. It just wasn't a small family in a forest setting anymore. And whatever we might have thought about that, that was what was going to happen. I remember, again, very early in the 70s, I and this woman named Mary were helping Swamiji just clean out some files or something, and he found the transcript of this reading from the book of Brigu, which he'd had in 1958 or 59, in which Brigu had said about him, Swami hadn't yet shared that now these things are better known, had said that Swamiji would become a global figure, that he would be famous throughout the world, that his influence would be tremendous on thousands of people. And Mary, who was just kind of not thinking, oh, wow, that sounds really cool, sort of like that, just a very teenager sort of response, although she wasn't a teenager. It was just her way, was to be enthusiastic. But I thought of just the wonderful, quiet simplicity, intimacy of the life that we had there. And Swami and I intuitively sort of exchanged that thought while the other gal was being enthusiastic. And Swami said, these are the good old days. Just like that. Change is inevitable, but these are the good old days right now, before all of that comes. And that was later, Swami said, that the first step for him to really carry out the work that Master gave him was for him to write what is now called The New Path, his autobiography, which is the story of his life with Master, and then all about Master, because nothing has been written since like that, a disciple's perspective with the kind of insight Swami brought. But Swamiji said, this work will only really get started after that book is published. And in that conversation, he had finished writing it. The whole manuscript was done. I was the typist, so I had a lot of access to that manuscript. And he was saying, once this book is published, then people will start coming to Ananda. People will start coming, to hear what he has to say about Master. And basically, Swami said everything will change. And there was just Seva and I and Swami at that point in the room. And I said, I could burn the manuscript. And so we've been working on this for years. And this was before computers or copiers. So, we had like 2 copies of the manuscript. Swami, for just a moment, he looked absolutely horror-stricken. Has she lost her mind? And then, because communication was largely intuitive, he knew exactly what I was saying, which is this is the golden period, and it would be nice if it lasted forever. And he said, it's not my book anymore. It belongs to Divine Mother. It's up to her what happens. And that was the end. And so much of that same conversation happened again. This is the line in the sand. Now, so here are the things, though, that Swami said that made him really want to do this. One of the things that was very nice about Ananda in those years was that we were very, very egalitarian. There was certainly no Nayaswami order. There was no group of people walking around in different colors with different meanings. We had a few people who were ministers. There were quite a few who were ministers. But we didn't have any ministerial garb. When you stood up to give a Sunday service, you wore more or less, just some nice version of what you would wear every day. Even now, when the light bearers come onto the dais to give Sunday service, everyone in the congregation stands up. None of that. It was very egalitarian. And there was a lot of very sincere concern on Swami's part, too, that we would start creating tiers, with recognizable tiers within the community. Not tiers like this, but levels, different levels. But Swamiji said he felt that was also vitally important that we do it, that the concept of communities could live beyond the boundaries of Ananda. And Ananda-inspired communities could happen in many ways. Master said it's going to spread like wildfire and be the lifestyle of the future. We haven't seen that yet, but the future is still the future. And he said, even within Ananda itself, Swamiji has always felt this, as the lifestyle of Ananda became more and more comfortable and more ideal for families, that people would come, good people, spiritually inclined, good people would come to Ananda, but their primary interest would be community, or their primary interest might be to create the right environment for their children. And Swamiji felt that it was very important that there be a visible declaration as to what Ananda really was about. And so the idea of there being a monastic order within Ananda, and the Nayaswami order came decades later and wasn't even on the horizon. So just put that whole present reality out of your mind. That there could be a defined reality that some of the people in the community, and it was not expected that all would do it, that some of the people would say, I'm here for God. And I'm here for God so completely that I have entered a monastic order. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm just going to keep being exactly who I am, but I'm going to call myself a monastic. It was that I would really have entered a monastic order with everything that that implied. And the mere fact that I might be married and might even have children would not diminish in any way my absolute commitment to live for God. And so that the community itself would always have this central vibration of deep commitment. And there would never, the opportunity wouldn't arise for the community itself to become defined by the periphery instead of by the center. And then we had all the conversation about people will join because they want to be they just want to be part of the in-group. People will feel like second-class citizens if they don't feel like joining. Swami just said, yes, yes, yes. All of those things. We open ourselves up to a whole new level of challenge, because that's what happens when you grow. But we don't avoid challenge by doing nothing either. So then the decision was made that we would do it, and we did go ahead, and we actually became recognized. I'm trying to think of exactly how the details of that go, but it was quite unusual for us to be able to win the IRS approval as a monastic order, because we didn't look like any monastic order that was there. So it was also, it's like the government influences us, and then we in turn influence the government, because we show what a Dwapara Yuga monastery might look like. Because it's a true fact, and it's a dilemma for the traditional monastic orders, the Catholics primarily, that they're not getting young postulants. And their whole system is set up, the young take care of the old and so on. But that kind of monastic life doesn't hold the same attractiveness for people that it has for all these many centuries. But the interesting fact, as Swami points it out, is not because people are less inclined toward God, but they don't see that as the definition of being dedicated to God. The Dwapara Yuga energy, where the vibration of energy defines things instead of the form, is making the rigidity of that form less attractive. People instinctively realize it's not, in this age, I want to be involved, I want to be with the people, I want to serve, I don't want to set myself apart, all the different words that people are using. So Ananda, of course, stands as having that kind of potential. Now, the other side of it that is also, and these are the principles that have that I've taken from all these things over these years is that, and I said this yesterday, and I was talking about it, Swamiji did not set the rules and then invite people in, show them what the rules were, and make them promise to follow them. Swami just let Ananda develop as it was going to develop. He guided it very powerfully, but not rigidly. He guided it with magnetism. He emanated the magnetism, he articulated the principles, and he magnetized people toward the ideal. But this is what I was saying, it came out of us. We sort of began to want to live that way, rather than seeing that we needed to live that way because this is how you do it. We began to want to live that way. So by the time we were ready to declare ourselves a monastery, and by the time that, these guidelines were written, Swami himself says, and starting at my next session, I'll just start with the words that are written here, is that what Swami did is he articulated what was already happening. And so it was not like an idea from somewhere that this would be a good idea. It was looking around and seeing what had actually worked, because by that time we were 12, 15 years into the experiment. And, that's half a generation. And people were able to, and the pattern had developed from the inner magnetism, rather than the pattern being imposed on people and hoping that it could become sincere. The inner magnetism itself had made a lifestyle, and we related to each other in ways that, of course, Swami was conscious of and guided. But it was always, as I said, it felt guided like from the inside. This is what spontaneously and genuinely makes us happy. If we are when self-realization is the goal, when meditation and service are the practices, when devotion is central to everything, this is how it looks. Now, I don't want to put it quite on this level, but it wasn't that far away from it. When Anandamoyi Ma was expressing her spiritual awakening, and she was the same from a little child to her elderly self, at times her body would assume certain mantras, certain mudras. Mudras are positions that are indicative of a spiritual attitude. I mean, even the pranam, putting both your palms together, putting your hand over your heart and bowing your head. People do this all the time as a gesture. But it's a mudra. We do it because when that mood of devotional respect comes over us, this is what the body would do to express it. The medulla would relax, because this is the ego. It would let go of the ego principle. We draw the energy in. We focus on the heart. And Anandamoyi Ma's body would spontaneously assume mudras, because the state of consciousness the mudra was supposed to cultivate within you would be within her, so her body would assume the position. It's yoga postures, various things. So with Ananda, over all those years, Swamiji had been, with extraordinary subtlety and skill, cultivating in a very large group of people. Certainly at least 100. I don't know how many of us there were at that point. And we were dispersed already by then. He'd just been developing the right vibration. And that right vibration then began to express itself: simplicity, moderation, cooperation. And then how do we relate to our homes, to our families, to our work? When you're in that vibration, what does it look like? So when Swamiji wrote what he wrote for these guidelines, and they aren't even rules, they're guidelines, we recognize them. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to have to really work to make that happen. It was, we just recognized it. Oh, that's a beautiful articulation of who we are, isn't it? And then, so the power was not from the paper, the power was from the people. And this just made it clear to ourselves, as well as clear to others who might want to join us, who we are and what we're doing. Okay, my friends. God bless you.